Alright, let's cut through the noise and get straight to the point. What if I told you that everything you've been taught about the serpent in Genesis is wrong? That the story you think you know, the one drilled into your head in Sunday school or Bible study, is missing the bigger picture? The word used for serpent in the original Hebrew is nāḥāš. Now, here's where things get interesting. Sure, it's often translated as a snake or serpent, but did you know that nāḥāš isn't just about a slithering reptile? The word has layered meanings. It's not just a noun, it's also connected to verbs like to whisper or to enchant, often linked with divination or gaining hidden knowledge. The very word used to describe the serpent in Genesis also implies a seeker or bringer of esoteric knowledge. And if you're already thinking, wait, that sounds deeper than just a snake, you're absolutely right. In ancient Near Eastern cultures, snakes were more than creepy animals slithering around. They were symbols, powerful ones. In Mesopotamian mythology, for example, we find references to the god Enki, often symbolized with serpentine imagery, who was a giver of wisdom and knowledge. In Egypt, snakes weren't just dangerous creatures, they were sacred. The uraeus, that famous cobra on Pharaoh's crown, symbolized divine authority and protection. And in Canaanite traditions, serpents were associated with healing and transformation. Does this sound like an evil trickster to you? This historical context raises a provocative question. Was the serpent in Genesis meant to be seen as purely evil, or was it a symbol with a much more complex role? Was it tempting Eve into sin, or was it offering her and Adam a path to knowledge, a path to awakening? These aren't new ideas. In fact, they've been floating around in academic circles and alternative interpretations for years, but they rarely make it into mainstream discussions. Why? Because they mess with the narrative we've been spoon-fed for centuries. Now let's zoom in on Genesis 3 itself. The serpent's interaction with Eve is fascinating. It doesn't command her, it doesn't force her hand. Instead, it asks questions. It challenges the divine prohibition with logic and curiosity. Did God really say? This is not the language of a deceiver, this is the language of a challenger, a provocateur, maybe even a teacher. And what about the fruit? Tradition paints it as an apple, but the text simply calls it the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The serpent's role here isn't about tempting Eve with something evil, it's about pointing her toward something transformative. After eating the fruit, the first thing Adam and Eve gain is knowledge. Their eyes are opened. They realize they're naked, vulnerable, aware of themselves in a way they weren't before. Is that not a fundamental leap in human consciousness? Was the serpent really a villain, or was it playing a role in humanity's awakening? And more importantly, why has that role been vilified for so long? Was it just theological convenience to cast the serpent as Satan? Because, spoiler alert, the Hebrew Bible doesn't actually call the serpent Satan. That's a much later interpretation, added centuries after Genesis was written. Alright, if the serpent in Genesis is more than just a snake, then we need to ask a bigger question: why a serpent? Why would the writer of Genesis choose this specific symbol to convey such a pivotal moment in human history? To answer that, we need to dive into the symbolism of serpents across ancient cultures, and trust me, what we're about to uncover will completely change the way you view this creature. Let's start with Egypt, where snakes were far from symbols of evil. The cobra, or uraeus, was a divine emblem of protection, worn by pharaohs to signify their power and connection to the gods. It wasn't just decoration, it was a statement. The snake was thought to ward off chaos and enemies. It represented order, divine authority, and sometimes even immortality. Now, compare that to the snake in Genesis, sitting at the center of a story about cosmic order and disruption. Coincidence? I don't think so. Now, over in Mesopotamia, serpents played an equally fascinating role. Take the god Enki, a major figure in Sumerian mythology. He's often depicted with flowing waters and serpentine imagery. Enki was the god of wisdom, magic, and life-giving water. He was seen as a benefactor, someone who shared knowledge with humanity, sometimes knowledge that went against the will of other gods. Sound familiar? That's another link between serpents and the transmission of knowledge. In Canaanite culture, which heavily influenced the biblical world, snakes were connected to transformation and healing. Ever heard of the symbol of the staff with two entwined serpents? That's the caduceus, which is still used in modern medicine. Snakes were seen as powerful agents of change, not inherently good or bad, but forces that could bring renewal or destruction, depending on how they were engaged. And then there's the Greek connection. Though the Genesis story predates classical Greek mythology, the parallels are striking. In Greek myths, serpents often guarded sacred treasures or forbidden knowledge. For example, in the story of the Garden of the Hesperides, a dragon serpent named Ladin guards the golden apples of immortality. Apples, forbidden fruit, a garden, it's not hard to see how these myths might have influenced each other. But here's where it gets really interesting, the serpent's dual symbolism. In nearly every ancient culture, snakes weren't just one thing. They were revered for their wisdom and feared for their venom. They represented life and death, creation and destruction. They were boundary crossers, moving between the earth and the underworld, the sacred and the profane. One last thing, snakes weren't random in these stories. They were carefully chosen symbols, loaded with meaning. They were never just animals, they were messengers, intermediaries, carriers of hidden truths. And the serpent in Genesis? It fits right into that pattern. This wasn't some random snake slithering into a garden. This was a symbol that carried with it centuries of cultural weight, layered meanings that we're only just beginning to unpack. The ancient Hebrew language often uses wordplay and layered meanings to convey deeper ideas. The word nāḥāš shares linguistic roots with terms that mean to shine or bright. Some scholars have even drawn parallels between nāḥāš and celestial imagery, like that of a shining figure, an angelic or divine being. Could the serpent have been portrayed as a radiant, almost otherworldly entity, not just a creature of the earth? And let's not forget the context. The serpent in Genesis is described as Aram, which is typically translated as crafty or cunning. But here's the twist, the same Hebrew word can also imply shrewdness or intelligence. It's a word that carries a neutral connotation, depending on how it's used. So, was the serpent being deceptive, or was it simply presenting a clever challenge to the status quo? The text doesn't definitively say, it leaves that interpretation wide open. Now, let's look at what the serpent actually does in the story. It doesn't lie outright. It asks a question, did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? And when Eve responds, it says, you will not surely die, for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Notice something here? The serpent doesn't actually contradict God, it just frames the situation in a new way. Here's the kicker, everything the serpent says turns out to be true. After eating the fruit, Adam and Eve don't drop dead. Instead, their eyes are opened, exactly as the serpent predicted. They gain knowledge, specifically the knowledge of good and evil. So, was the serpent lying, or was it revealing a truth that had been kept from humanity? This brings us to another critical detail, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Why was this tree off limits in the first place? The Hebrew text doesn't say that the tree itself was evil, only that it would grant knowledge. That's a huge distinction. The serpent didn't tempt Eve with sin, it tempted her with understanding. And isn't that what humans have always sought? From the earliest myths to modern science, the pursuit of knowledge has been central to our identity. The serpent's actions align with a recurring theme in ancient Jewish literature, figures who challenge divine boundaries to benefit humanity. Think of Prometheus stealing fire for the Greeks or Enki sharing wisdom in Mesopotamian myths. The serpent fits this archetype perfectly. It's not purely good or evil, it's a boundary crosser, someone, or something, that disrupts the natural order to create something new. Alright, now that we've dissected the serpent's linguistic and cultural context, let's focus on its role in the narrative of Genesis 3 itself. We know the serpent is described as crafty, shrewd, and possibly tied to knowledge. But let's break down the actual sequence of events and what they reveal. The serpent initiates the pivotal conversation in the story. Think about that for a second, it's not God, not Adam, not Eve. It's the serpent that drives the narrative forward. Its opening line is a question: did God really say, "You must not eat from any tree in the garden"? Notice how strategic this is. The serpent doesn't make a direct accusation against God or an explicit claim. It opens with a question, a challenge to the status quo that invites Eve to reflect and engage. This isn't random, it's calculated. Eve responds by clarifying God's command, but her answer reveals something fascinating. She says, "We may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say, 'You must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die.'" Hold up, or you will die. That's the key phrase here. The serpent's response directly challenges this, claiming, "You will not surely die." After eating the fruit, Adam and Eve don't immediately die. Instead, the text says their eyes are opened, and they realize they're naked. So, was the serpent lying, or was God's warning about death metaphorical? Maybe it referred to spiritual death or a shift in their relationship with the divine. Either way, the serpent's claim that their eyes would be open turns out to be absolutely true. They gain knowledge, specifically, the knowledge of good and evil. Now, let's dig into that concept, the knowledge of good and evil. What does it mean? Scholars have debated this for centuries. Some argue it represents moral awareness, the ability to distinguish between right and wrong. Others suggest it's about autonomy, the power to make independent decisions outside divine control. Either way, it's a monumental moment in human history, and the serpent is the catalyst. Here's the kicker: God's response to Adam and Eve eating the fruit confirms the serpent's claim. In Genesis 3 verse 22, God says, "The man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil." Think about that. God acknowledges that the humans have gained divine-like knowledge. This raises a provocative question: was the serpent's role one of deception, or was it simply presenting an uncomfortable truth? The serpent's actions don't end there. It shifts the power dynamics of the entire narrative. By convincing Eve to eat the fruit, it disrupts the perfect order of the Garden of Eden. This isn't just about breaking a rule, it's about challenging a system where knowledge and authority are centralized in the divine. The serpent's role forces humanity to step into a new reality, one of choice, consequence, and responsibility. And let's not overlook Adam and Eve's actions. The text often frames Eve as the one who was deceived, but look closely, she carefully evaluates the serpent's words, observes the tree, and makes a decision. This isn't blind temptation, it's a conscious act. Adam, on the other hand, takes the fruit from Eve and eats without question. What does that say about their roles in this story? Here's another layer: the serpent isn't punished with annihilation or destruction. Instead, it's cursed to crawl on its belly and eat dust. Why? Could this be a symbolic way of neutralizing the serpent's power while preserving its role in the cosmic order? The text doesn't say explicitly, but it's worth considering. Now, let's dive into a realm that rarely gets enough attention: how early Jewish and Christian traditions interpreted the serpent. First, let's talk about early Jewish interpretations. In the centuries before and after Genesis was written, Jewish thinkers and rabbis engaged in debates about the meaning of the serpent. One key source is the Talmud, where rabbinic discussions suggest that the serpent might not have been a literal snake at all. Some rabbis speculated that the serpent was a kind of humanoid creature, intelligent, possibly even divine in origin, and capable of speech. They didn't see it as merely a tool of deception, but as a significant character with its own agenda. Then there's the Book of Enoch, an ancient Jewish text that isn't included in the Hebrew Bible, but was widely read during the Second Temple period. Enoch expands on the idea of supernatural beings interacting with humanity, including watchers who bring forbidden knowledge to mankind. While it doesn't directly address the serpent, it frames the broader cultural context, a fascination with entities that challenge divine boundaries by revealing hidden truths. Let's shift to early Christian interpretations. By the time the New Testament was written, the serpent had undergone a radical transformation. In Revelation 12 verse 9, the serpent is explicitly identified as Satan, described as that ancient serpent, who is called the devil. This connection isn't present in Genesis itself, it's a later reinterpretation that shaped Christian theology for centuries. But here's the question: why was the serpent linked to Satan in the first place? To understand this, we need to consider the early Christian context. The followers of Jesus were operating in a world deeply influenced by dualistic philosophies, especially those of the Gnostics and Zoroastrians. These systems emphasized a cosmic battle between good and evil, and the serpent fit neatly into this framework as a symbol of rebellion against divine order. This reinterpretation served a theological purpose, but it's not rooted in the original Hebrew text of Genesis. Speaking of Gnosticism, this is where things get really wild. In certain Gnostic traditions, the serpent is actually seen as a hero. That's right, instead of being a deceiver, it's a liberator, an entity that reveals the truth and empowers humanity to break free from ignorance. These Gnostic texts argue that the God of Genesis, often referred to as the demiurge, was a tyrannical figure who sought to keep humanity in darkness. The serpent, by encouraging Eve to eat the fruit, becomes a savior figure, bringing enlightenment. Of course, this interpretation was condemned as heresy by the early church, but it shows just how diverse and controversial the serpent's image was in the ancient world. Far from being a simple villain, it was a symbol that could represent everything from temptation to liberation, depending on who was telling the story. And then there's the symbolism of the serpent in the wilderness from the Book of Numbers, where Moses lifts up a bronze serpent to heal the Israelites. Think about that for a second. The same creature that's vilified in Genesis is later used as a symbol of salvation. This duality is not a coincidence, it's a recurring theme in the Bible and ancient Jewish thought. The Bible wasn't written in a vacuum. It emerged in a cultural melting pot where ideas flowed between civilizations, and the serpent in Genesis is no exception. Let's start with Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization and a key influence on early Israelite thought. One of the most striking parallels to the Genesis story is found in the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest pieces of literature in the world. In this epic, Gilgamesh seeks immortality and eventually finds a plant that grants eternal life. But before he can use it, a serpent steals it and sheds its skin, symbolizing renewal and immortality. Sound familiar? The parallels are undeniable. A serpent, a garden-like setting, a quest for divine knowledge or immortality, it's all there. Now, over to Canaanite religion, which also left its mark on the Bible. The Canaanites revered serpents as symbols of fertility, healing, and divine power. One key figure is the god Baal, who, in some texts, battles a serpentine sea monster called Lotan. This imagery of serpents as powerful, divine beings could have influenced the way ancient Israelites understood their own stories. Remember, the Israelites lived among the Canaanites and absorbed aspects of their culture, even as they defined their own identity. Moving on to Egypt, where serpents played a dual role as protectors and threats. The goddess Wadjet, often depicted as a cobra, was a symbol of royal authority and divine protection. On the flip side, the serpent Apophis represented chaos and was constantly at war with the sun god Ra. This duality, the serpent as both a protector and a destroyer, mirrors the complexity of the serpent's role in Genesis. It's not purely evil, it's a force to be reckoned with. But wait, it gets even more fascinating. Ancient Ugaritic texts, from a city closely tied to early Israelite culture, speak of a divine figure named Kotha Wa Karsis, a craftsman god who wields serpentine imagery. In one myth, he creates weapons to defeat sea monsters, reinforcing the serpent's association with power, wisdom, and transformation. Could these stories have informed the way the Genesis serpent was portrayed? Absolutely. And then there's Hittite mythology, where serpents often appear in ritual texts as mediators between gods and humans. They weren't just animals, they were sacred beings with a role in maintaining cosmic balance. This idea of the serpent as a mediator aligns intriguingly with its role in Genesis. It bridges the gap between divine knowledge and human experience, acting as a catalyst for change. One more fascinating connection, the concept of sacred gardens. From the Sumerian myth of Dilmun to the Persian paradise gardens, the idea of a lush, divine space guarded by serpents or supernatural beings is a recurring motif in ancient stories. Genesis fits into this tradition, but with a unique twist. Instead of the serpent guarding the garden, it disrupts it, introducing humanity to knowledge and self-awareness. What happens if we reinterpret the serpent's role in Genesis altogether? To understand this, we need to look at the broader context of the Bible's themes. Genesis isn't just a story about creation, it's a story about boundaries, who sets them, who enforces them, and who dares to cross them. The serpent is a boundary crosser. It disrupts the natural order of Eden, not through brute force, but through persuasion and logic. It makes humanity aware of something they were blind to before, the possibility of choice. Before the serpent enters the scene, Adam and Eve live in a state of naivete. They follow rules without understanding why. The serpent's intervention changes that. By questioning God's command, it introduces the idea of autonomy. And once they eat the fruit, they gain something profound, moral discernment. Sure, this comes with consequences, banishment, labor, death, but it also marks the beginning of humanity's intellectual and spiritual journey. And here's the kicker, the serpent's role parallels other biblical figures who challenge divine authority. Take the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel or Moses confronting Pharaoh. These aren't tales of blind obedience, they're tales of struggle, questioning, and transformation. The serpent's actions fit right into this tradition. It forces humanity to grapple with difficult questions about freedom, responsibility, and the cost of knowledge. Now, think about the tree of knowledge itself. Why would a loving God place something so dangerous in the middle of the garden and then forbid it? Was it a test? A trap? Or was it an invitation? The serpent frames the tree not as a threat, but as an opportunity, a way for humanity to become more like the divine, knowing good and evil. This framing doesn't necessarily make the serpent good, but it complicates the narrative. It shows that Genesis isn't a simple morality tale, it's a story about complexity, risk, and growth. Here's another layer to consider, the serpent's punishment. In Genesis 3 verse 14, it's cursed to crawl on its belly and eat dust. This isn't just a physical transformation, it's a symbolic act of humiliation and containment. The serpent, once a figure that moved between realms, earthly and divine, is now bound to the ground, stripped of its intermediary power. But why not destroy it outright? Could it be that the serpent's role as a provocateur was essential to the story's purpose? And let's talk about humanity's punishment, too. Adam and Eve are cast out of Eden, but they aren't annihilated. Instead, they're sent into the world to live, to create, to struggle. The serpent's actions lead to the loss of Eden, but they also lead to the birth of human civilization. Without the serpent, there's no story, no humanity as we know it. Before we wrap up, I want to thank you all for joining me on this journey. The story of the serpent in Genesis is far more complex than most of us were taught, and it's a testament to the richness of ancient storytelling. If this video challenged your thinking or opened your eyes to new ideas, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives like this. And don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear your take on everything we've explored. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.